Frank Stilwell is a long-standing critic of conventional economics. He is now Professor Emeritus at the School of Social and Political Sciences and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He has written and co-edited 20 books on political economic issues, most recently The Political Economy of Inequality and Alternative Theories of Political Economy. Welcome, Frank. We are looking forward to hearing from you. Please.
Thank you, Fernanda, and it is indeed a pleasure to accept your invitation to talk. Most of us understand inflation as rising prices, and the typical measure of that is the consumer price index. Think, for example, of housing. People who stick their money into housing or other tangible assets may see, though, the value of that housing sometimes surge very dramatically. Now, that's not normally picked up in normal discussions of inflation, but it's very important, not least in pointing to the fact that some people have a vested interest in inflationary processes in the things that they own. People who own multiple properties, for example, houses, commercial properties, land, most fundamentally, have an interest in the value of that rising over time. So whereas some people are just doing it tougher, putting bread on the table, trying to shop in their local stores, others are gloating because their wealth is increasing. So that's an early indication of what I think is a central theme in any political economic analysis of inflation, is its relationship to inequality. Inequality both as a driver, because people do have self-interest and a stake in the inflationary process. Some do, the more wealthy members of society, whereas others are, so to speak, the victims of inflation. Most particularly, of course, people on low and fixed incomes for whom a rising cost of living is a real social stress. So those are, I think, a foretaste of some reasons why we should be concerned about the resurgence of this phenomenon that looked like it had been licked during the 90s and noughties. Certainly, up until recently, inflation in Australia has been pretty low, averaging around 3% over the last couple of decades. Now we're seeing it running at double that level. So the fears of higher inflation are real and need to be a matter of social concern and public policy. Mark you, it's still within moderate bounds by international and historical standards. I mean, we're not talking about the sort of hyperinflation that affected the German economy back in the 1920s, when apparently people used to take their wages home in wheelbarrows because, you know, paid in notes or cash, which was almost valueless. They had to transport huge amounts of it around. People used sheets of postage stamps in place of wallpaper because it was cheaper to do so. The currency had become so devalued by the inflationary processes. Partly, I might say as an aside, because the treatment of Germany after the Second World War was unnecessarily vindictive by the winning powers, who, contrary to the advice of John Maynard Keynes, widely regarded as the greatest economist of that era, were really putting the squeeze on Germany, which caused hyperinflationary pressures, eventually led to the rise of Adolf Hitler, fascism, and the Second World War. So that's a rather extreme case, and we're not there yet. But I will come back to that question of war in a moment. Suffice to say that inflation matters because it increases the cost of living, it increases inequality, most particularly when inflation is followed by rising interest rates, led, for example, in the Australian case, by the Reserve Bank of Australia's policies, because rising interest rates very reliably transfer money from poor to rich, from borrowers, people who need to borrow, in order to, across to people who can get more income now on their accumulated savings and wealth. So that question of inequality on the agenda again. So why is this problem, which we thought we had licked, at least here in Australia, so resurgent again now? Well, the conventional mainstream economic answer to the cause of inflation centers on a debate around whether it's a demand push or wage pull process. Is it because people have got so much money relative to the amount of goods and services that the prices of those goods get bidded up? I don't think so. It's not to say it can't happen. There can be high levels of aggregate demand in the economy over and above the productive capacity, and that can create situations which are inflationary. But that's not the current situation. Indeed, the big hit that the economy took during the COVID years arguably has created the reverse. Well, what about wages push? Certainly in the Australian case, there's no evidence that there's a wage price spiral driven by increasing wages. Indeed, here's a copy of the Journal of Australian Political Economy, of which I'm the co-editor, which some while ago, before COVID actually, pointed to the long-term trends to more and more wages being suppressed below non-wage incomes. In other words, the shift from wages to profit has been the dominant feature of this era, actually preceding the recent surge of inflation, but laying completely to bed the idea that the trade unions and excessive wage rises are the causal factor here. All the economic commentators are, I think, agreed on this. Here in Sydney, Ross Gittins writes about it regularly in the Sydney Morning Herald. Don't blame wage push. That's not the issue. Rather, it's profiteering, which is a much more substantial driver, because it's that shift from wages to profits, which is the underlying economic reality here. Well, the alternative way, well, once you get out of these rather sterile debates around demand and wage push causes of inflation, is to recognize its historically contingent character. In other words, there's no uniform laws of motion that apply at all times in all places. You've got to look at the historical and specific circumstances that pertain in particular industries, particular places at particular times. And the classic illustration of that is to point to the effects of war, because war, almost without exception, I hesitate to say, but almost without exception, drives inflation. You do get a shortage of goods in those circumstances as resources are mobilized for military purposes, which means that there's less available for peacetime trade. And of course, during periods of war, often international shipping, international transport of goods and services is interrupted, if not completely curtailed. And that creates bottlenecks. We're seeing it now with the war in Ukraine. Problems of energy supply on a global scale, problems of food shortages, which are driving up prices. Indeed, arguably, around 50% of the inflationary process at the moment is a consequence of those global forces in which the war on Ukraine is the central factor. This I think is very significant. Certainly that's the analysis that the Australia Institute, the Centre for Peace, for Future Work, are tending to point to. About 50% of the inflation being imported inflation in the Australian case, driven by those unfortunate external circumstances, indeed diabolical external circumstances. But the other 50%, according to those studies, is to do with profiteering. And that comes to who has the power to control prices. It's not you and me. For the most part, prices are set by large corporations. Sure, the prices that are set reflect changing market conditions, but they also reflect changing power relationships. The increased concentration of capital going hand in hand with the diminished influence of trade unions in the economy is one such major power shift that goes a long way to explaining the other 50%. And it tends to happen in war, but it is, I think, arguably a more long-term trend. My recurrent references to war, though unfortunately in many respects, are, I think, a little pointer to this contingency, though, as to why inflation would surge at a particular point of time, even though these shifts in power relationships are taking place more slowly over long periods of time. I remember from my youth a movie with James Dean, I think it's called East of Eden, where the young James Dean is playing a farm boy who's trying to impress his dad by selling the beans during the Second World War at very inflated prices. And his dad ticks him off and says, no, you've got to charge fair prices for our product. You can't engage in war profiteering. Well, it was a nice, healthy warning. I also recall, of course, the great Canadian-American economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, whose career really started to surge, or at least come to public attention during those Second World War years, when he was in charge of price administration for the US government. He became a much hated figure among business people. That's long before he wrote his popular books on political economy, because he had that early role in trying to regulate the war profiteering that would otherwise have driven much more rapid inflation in the US economy. So this is an example of contingent factors. And here in Australia, the Korean War, for example, in the early 1950s, saw inflation hit the highest level ever in Australia at around 24%. It came down very rapidly, but that war and the redirection of resources into military efforts, and in particular, the capturing of the US government of the lion's share of the international wool trade, which pushed up wool prices by 250% in 1 year, really triggered that incredible inflationary spike. Things came down again, and for the 50s and 60s, for the most part, inflation was around average of 3%, a little higher in some years, a little lower in others. But it was a golden era in terms of conventional economic indicators, economic growth, full employment, and no inflation of any significance. But then, of course, comes along another shock, the OPEC oil crisis in the early 1970s. The suppliers of oil, particularly those in the Middle East, decide that they want to exert their market power by, in a sense, using their monopoly control over this limited natural resource to get more money from the purchasing countries, North America, Australasia, Europe, and so on. They wanted a better deal. They were fed up with being at the rough end of the pineapple, and they jacked up the prices, using their power as a cartel to do so. And that triggered off 2 decades of inflationary problems. At that time, yes, there was some sort of wage price spiral. Not surprisingly, workers wanted to keep up in their wage demands with the rising prices of that era. And many were quite successful in doing so. The Hawke government put a bit of a dampener on that when it introduced the Accord with a sort of a wage price index policy, which prevented inflation surging. But it wasn't until the recession of the early 1990s that inflation came to an end. Indeed, that was the end of the era that came to be known as stagflation, simultaneous stagnation, manifested in unemployment, and inflationary tendencies. We thought we got the problem licked, and certainly in the Reserve Bank of Australia, a complacency set in. I think they said, oh, we're going to do monetary targeting from now on. We're not going to allow inflation to go out of that band beyond about 2 to 3% per annum. And for a while there, it did look like it was working. But now, clearly, the wheels have come off. People are saying the Reserve Bank is now part of the problem, not part of the solution, because the way in which it's responded to inflation is by raising interest rates. But that only makes the problem worse. It increases the costs for many people. People trying to buy a house, for example, now have to pay much more on their mortgage loans. And that flows through into higher rents. So raising interest rates can be a driver of further inflation, not a means of choking off the excess demand, which they characteristically, according to this mainstream reasoning, see as the cause of the problem itself. I'm not unsympathetic to the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. He's managing an institution which has some degree of independence, and all they've got to deal with the inflationary problem is one single policy instrument, essentially, in this era. After the deregulation of the financial system, all they can do is to adjust the cash rate, and with the expectation that that will flow on to other interest rates set by banks for borrowers, whether business or housing loan borrowers, and the rates, which somewhat more slowly, they adjust on payments to people who deposit money with them. So, as they say in the cliche, if the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so rising inflation leads the Reserve Bank to jack up the cash rate, and lo and behold, it doesn't solve the problem. It only makes things worse, particularly for people who are trying to survive in increasingly difficult and unaffordable housing markets. So what could be done? Well, there are other policy responses. Obviously, in the analysis that I presented, as with Steve's analysis of the role of the markup in driving inflation, we need to deal with the abuse of corporate power. Indeed, more fundamentally, not just the abuse, the existence of concentrated corporate power. Regulatory mechanisms prohibiting price rises were attempted by the Whitlam government in Australia in the 1970s, set up the Prices Justification Tribunal. That institution didn't last, but it did at least show that there is some role for government in directly addressing corporate power. These days, we only do it indirectly through the ACCC and other attempts to somehow constrain what monopolists do. But unless we get to that root of the problem, there's not going to be no long-term solution, I fear. And I'm not just saying that in isolation, because I think just to attack corporate power in an inflationary period is not really the name of the game. The name of the game is to reorient economic policy more generally. A Green New Deal, for example, that would contain within it a reorientation of the economy to more sustainable activities, like energy. If we get renewable energy as a major feature of Australian industry, then we get off the inflationary pressures associated with the fossil fuel cycle, as well as, of course, making a greater contribution, long overdue, to dealing with the challenge of climate change. Housing policy, another sector where governments could get in to try to change the inflationary pressures. More social and public housing not only would increase the supply of housing, but it will put a check on the profiteering tendencies of banks and other institutions that have got a vested interest in perpetuating increased housing values. This is what some call the asset economy and its political power. It's got to be challenged by action at the governmental level. Otherwise, over time, the problem will become increasingly intractable. Well, the post-Keynesian economist Joan Robinson used to famously say that the answers to most economic problems are, of course, political questions. And so I pose that to conclude my remarks. Faced with the economic challenge of inflation, have we got the political will and the political capacity to embrace a Green New Deal, social and affordable housing policies, the redistribution of income, the curtailment of concentration of corporate power in a way that would genuinely make a more sustainable and fairer Australia?
Steve Keen rose to prominence after predicting the 2008 financial crisis, for which he received the Revere Award from the Real World Economics Review. Steve has published several books, including The New Economics, a Manifesto in 2021, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis in 2017, and Debunking Economics 2011. So welcome, Steve. We are really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be on here with Frank as well. As I noted at the end, we've been friends for over 50 years. And we met in 1971, and between us, we led a revolt over the teaching of economics in 1973. So I finished with a little note about that. What we're seeing now is something that hasn't been around for pretty much as long as Frank and I have been friends. That's rise in the level of inflation. And if you take a look at the long-term pattern for inflation going right back to the end of the Second World War, there was this big surge you can see in the middle, and that was the period when Frank and I became colleagues in the 1970s, two huge peaks to inflation. And now we're seeing another one over here with COVID. So, are we back to the same experience as we had back in the 1970s with rising inflation? Though I'll note already, you can see a downward trend. This is American data, but over the last 6 months, it's fallen from 8% per annum to 6% per annum. So we're potentially on the other side of that peak there. Now, mainstream economics is a waste of time, so I won't go there. What I want to show is a non-mainstream approach to saying how can we actually see what are the causal factors in inflation. And this comes from the distinctly non-mainstream economist Mikhail Koleski, who is regarded as the Polish engineering mathematician who came up with Keynes's ideas before Keynes. And he said you can describe nominal output, the actual recorded value of GDP, as the price level times this imputed thing we call real output. So he starts from that particular relation. Nominal output is the price level times real output. And then he says, well, profit is a fraction of nominal output. So wages are 1 minus that fraction. So you then say profit is some fraction M multiplied by what current income is. Therefore, wages are 1 minus M times the income level. And wages are also, he assumes a a constant average wage. These are simplifying assumptions, unlike the fantasy assumptions that neoclassical economists make. So you say the total wage bill is the wage rate times how many people have a job. And then real output, you can say, is number of workers times what we call labour productivity, but it's really, I prefer to call it just the output to labour ratio, because it's not a case of workers working harder and being more productive or less hard and less productive. It's management decisions about which machines to run and which new machines to install. So once you've done all that, you get this expression. And it says prices are 1/1 minus that work capitalist share multiplied by nominal wages divided by the labour to output ratio. So that's markups, which are set by capitalists. That's wages, which depend upon wage bargaining. That's a struggle between workers and capitalists. And this is really conditions of production determined by employers, not so much by workers. So you put that together and you can say inflation has three causes: change in the markup, and that's something which is under the control of firms and management, not of workers. It increases inflation when it goes up. And of course, it's not recorded by the statisticians, because statisticians are advised by neoclassical economists and they don't think this even matters. So I derive the markup from the other numbers in the data set I'm going to use here. That's the rate of change of wages, the nominal wage rate. And again, that depends bargaining between employers and employees. It'll increase inflation, and it is recorded by statisticians. And then this one here, that's the output to labour ratio. That again depends on conditions of production. If that increases, that reduces inflation. It's a negative. And I take account of that later. And that's also recorded by statisticians. Well, I don't think it's labour productivity, as I said. What you've got is a growing ratio of machinery to labour over time, where machines can process much more energy than unskilled workers can do. And its cyclical trends depend upon varying utilisation of industrial capacity, varying use of overhead labour, and so on. It's not workers working harder. You know, the whole idea of boosting the economy by making workers work harder, I think, is just nonsense, given the nature of industrial production. So what varies the markup and is what Koleski called the degree of competition. And so the more competition you feel as a manufacturer, the less likely you are to put your markup. So you have a boom going on, stuff is just flying out of the shop, and that means you feel like you can increase your markup. If there's a slump going on, you reduce your markup, you're trying to encourage customers to shop with you rather than your rivals. And money supply growth can vary how much firms perceive a degree of competition. So if you have a boom, which can be fueled by either credit or fiat-based money, and that's the distinction between the 1970s boom and the post-COVID boom. It's where the credit or fiat money did it. That can lead to manufacturers putting up markups. A slump does the opposite, of course. Now, the money wage, as I said, reflects the bargaining powers that workers have. And there used to be these things called trade unions. It's virtually been eliminated in America. I'll show you data on that shortly. And also then, of course, the level and the rate of change of employment. So if you have high and rising employment, then wages can rise. But if you have high and rising unemployment, wages can fall. So that's the overall pattern. And then I said again, that A term reflects conditions of production. It's normally rising over time, and that gives us a deflationary trend in capitalism. But during COVID and with the energy shortages, we've said, with the final occurrence of peak oil, which I'm happy to talk about later, and the impact of climate change on production as well, it's falling and adding to inflation. Now, COVID was quite a weird experience and continuing weird experience in many ways. Again, you had a period of an initial rise in real wages. This is quite strange in some ways, a dramatic increase from 3% to 8% increase in nominal wages in the very beginning of the crisis. Just, you know, there was a real scattergun effect on the economy. And you got a sharp rise in unemployment as well at the same time, but then it collapsed. Unemployment fell dramatically and is still falling. But despite the fact we've got falling unemployment, which in the 70s would have given rising bargaining power for workers, real wages continued to fall. So the whole cause of the boom in the early, going from a slump to a boom, was a gigantic increase in the government deficit. It went from under 10% of GDP to almost 25% over between October 2019 and April 2020. And if that hadn't happened, we would have had a financial crisis, a collapse of the economy at the time, because people couldn't pay their rents, landlords couldn't pay their mortgages, et cetera, we would have had a crisis. So I'm not attacking that deficit at all, but I'm saying that provided the perception for manufacturers that they could put markups up. And what you find again, rising markups, rising inflation, and falling output to labour ratio, which of course adds to that inflation once more. So workers are nowhere to be seen in that picture. Again, it's what manufacturers are doing and deciding to do that is causing a sustained period of inflation. Now, so there's common features. We can say there's an initial increase in the nominal wage with falling inflation, so you get higher real wages out of that. But then what sustained the inflation over time is rising markups, not rising wages. The different features are that in the 70s, workers could bargain for wage rises in excess of inflation. In the 2020s, they can't. Even after inflation has eroded real wages for decades of effective stagnation and living standards of workers, particularly in America, their share of GDP has not recovered, courtesy of the increase in employment after COVID, because what individual worker is going to go up and bargain against Jeff Bezos? Okay, so what's happened is they're finally organising unions again, but their capacity to bargain has been destroyed. Now, the mainstream ignores this because they believe that the actual determination of wages and profits is what they call marginal productivity, got nothing to do with whether you're organised in a trade union or not. So you don't need to look at the data. That's a typical thing the classicals do. Start with a belief that rules out looking at the data. And this is the data. And you can see a very obvious negative relationship between the higher the level of union membership, the lower the share going to the top 10%. So it is a struggle over power. It's distribution of power that leads to the distribution of income. That's ignored by the mainstream. It's what matters in the real world. And that's very simple analysis that I've done there. There's a very detailed paper by Weber and Weilsner from the University of Amherst, which is one of the few universities on the planet where there's non-mainstream economists in charge. And what they've found is for a while a trend for declining profit margins, but you'll notice the profit margins go in the same direction, rising profit margin during the period of inflation, again, rising profit share during the period of inflation. So they capture the same cyclical thing I identified a while ago, that rising markups drives inflation, not rising wages. But notice there's a trend for falling markups, which continued well after the period of inflation in the 1970s. And Kolesky's decomposition just breaks the population into workers and capitalists. It leaves out bankers. So I'm going to include bankers in there and take a look at it. And what you find, and this is probably to me the most important difference between what's happening now and what happened in the 70s, private debt has risen dramatically from where it was in the 1970s. This has been the real impact of deregulation, an enormous increase in the financialization of the economy, and far more financial engineering and not enough real engineering. So if you take a look at the level of private debt in both America and Australia, in Australia's case, the level of private debt has more than trebled from what it was in the 1970s. The American level has doubled. And that's ignored by the mainstream, that they don't think private debt matters. Of course, yet again, they're wrong. What that increased level of private debt means, the economy is much more fragile, financially fragile, than it was back in the 1970s. So what the central banks are doing to try to control inflation is actually hitting smashing the economy at its most fragile point, the level of debt, the potential for the banking sector to go bankrupt. Now, what I've done in my own intellectual work is I've now built a model of what's called Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And an unexpected outcome of that model was that rising private debt causes the worker's share of GDP to fall. And I'll put a quick illustration of that up. I'm happy to show it in more detail later. This is a mathematical model in the software package I invented called Minsky. And you'll notice that over time, there's a rising share going to bankers, and that's coming at the expense of workers. Pardon me, I clicked the mouse by accident there. So the dynamics of a rising level of private debt in a capitalist economy mean the workers' share of income goes down, not the capitalists. Okay, so that on the top of it is also causing workers to get less of a share of GDP than the loss of bargaining power has also given them. Now, what we've got, we've got mainstream economists in charge of the economy, which is a bit like having toll-make astronomers in charge of the moonshot. We would never have got there. But all they think is they think they can control the rate of inflation by putting up the rate of interest. And they believe they can do it without doing much damage to the economy. They think what they're varying is what they call inflationary expectations. And this is one of the few times I like a comment by Paul Krugman. He calls it the inflation fairy. So they think they can put the inflationary expectations up and not damage the economy. In fact, what they do when they put interest rates up, they crush the economy. They cause corporations to go bankrupt. They crush credit demand, et cetera, et cetera. And so there again, their work on this, in my opinion, is nonsense. There's a great non-orthodox economist called Blair Fix, and I've linked to his website through that link there. I'll pass it on to Fernanda later when I finish giving the presentation. He's done a fabulous, very detailed analysis of all the OECD nations and said the inflation, rather than higher interest rates meaning lower inflation, higher interest rates mean higher inflation, not that putting up interest rates causes inflation to rise so much, but that inflation, interest rates don't control inflation, but inflation does control interest rates, so to speak. The causation is the opposite of what the mainstream thinks. Now, what we're seeing instead, of course, the economy hasn't quite fallen over yet, but the banking sector has started to. And that's something the mainstream should know about, but as Frank and I know well, mainstream economists pretend you can model capitalism without including money. So they don't have money or banks or debt in their mathematical models of the economy. And they therefore end up, except for the people who are fiduciary, sensible people inside the banks, who are often probably horrified by what the policy economists are doing, they don't realize the impact that their interest rate rises have on the banks themselves. So banks have three broad types of assets. They have reserves, and they're like the deposit accounts of private banks at the central bank, and they are unaffected by their value is the same as the value of the dollar. It doesn't get affected by interest rates. Loans to the non-bank private sector, and that's what rising interest rates tend to cut off. They cause credit to go negative, so loans fall rather than rise. But the other thing they have is bonds, government bonds. And because those bonds have what's called a fixed coupon rate, so if you buy a $1,000 bond and the rate of interest is 1%, you get $10 per year because of that bond. But if interest rates double, that bond's worth half as much. That's a simple case in what's called a consort, which is a bond that lasts forever. But if you have it paying $20 a year and it's therefore 2%, if rates rise to 4%, that bond value falls in half. And that can mean that the bank's liabilities, which are fundamentally our deposit accounts at the banks, they're not changing in the aggregate, but the value of the assets is falling, so they can get to the stage where they collapse. So if you increase the interest rates from 3% to 5%, you can actually send the equity of the banking sector negative. The value of the bonds can fall so much that the banking sector is sent bankrupt. And that's crazy, because the real reason federal central banks were created in the first place was to maintain the integrity of the payment system. But because we've got neoclassical economists in charge who have this fantasy economics that believes they can control the rate of inflation by varying the rate of interest, they're actually destroying the stability of the payment system they're supposed to be protecting.
Thank you, Steve. I think we're getting lots of questions after that presentation. And I'm going to start with Jim Stanford, ask him to make his question in a moment. But before that, I want to just clarify something. So Steve showed his presentation that the markups are causing the inflation at the moment, and Frank supported that view, like one of the main causes, right? So I imagine the the companies, they're making more profit, right? So that shift from wages to profits happening there because of the inflation. So they are winning with the inflation. But then I think both of you said that rising interest rates, which is the remedy they're using for inflation, it's also a transfer of money from poor to rich. So both things have the same winners. The inflation has the winner of the corporate sector, and the remedy for the inflation is also favoring them. Is that it? Like, is it that grim, the situation?
Well, it's grim unless we are able as a society to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. As a society. And how, as a society? I really like that answer. How can we do that?
How does social change occur? It can occur through governmental leadership. That's always been the declared ambition of Fabians, more generally of people around Labour politics. Greens, increasingly, although Greens also have a strong emphasis on grassroots activities as direct solutions to the problem. I mean, we could get off money altogether by building self-sustaining communities that exchange and cooperate without necessary reliance on money. There are political economists who argue that that could be not just a locally viable model within particular communities, but could increasingly become a more generalizable model for a future post-growth society. This raises some bigger questions than the topic purely of tonight's, but they're illustrative of that as soon as you raise the politics of political economy, you have to start talking about what is to be done and by whom. Yes. We've got a Prime Minister now who's a former student of political economy at Sydney University, out of the same stable as Steve Keen and myself. I'm not holding my breath that he's actually going to wave any magic wand from Canberra, but one would like to think that he understands the issues, even though he and his government may be a little bit timid in producing radical policies that would help us to take a new direction.
Steve, would you like to comment anything about this, or?
Well, just quickly, I'll go back to the 70s again, and at that stage after political economy, I was peripherally involved with the trade union movement in the writing of the Accord, and a major component of the Accord was supposed to be getting a worker management collaboration to prevent the sort of wage price spiral that we saw. What actually happened, both inside the Labor Party and inside the bureaucracy, was that they saw it as a way of causing wage cuts using superannuation. So the wage pressure was taken up by wage rises turning up as increases in superannuation payments, not in prices. And the whole idea of a wages and it actually called the Wages and Prices Accord when it was first written. And the idea was to bring about the sort of cooperation that the Swedish political economy system had at the time. It doesn't anymore, and that Galbraith was responsible for during the Second World War. So rather than having the political struggle leading to inflation, as Frank was explaining, you had a political agreement to say to taper price rises, perhaps also taper industrial action by unions instead. Instead, it all got turned into a neoliberal thing about reducing inflation by reducing wage rises. And the ultimate outcome was neoclassical economists taking over everything. And now, believing they can reduce inflation by increasing the interest rate, which in their models causes this is very strange noise I'm hearing in the background. It sounds like Tony Abbott sucking on something. Can somebody please check that?
I just muted that person.
I love it.
Good. Thank you. Okay.
I think I will let Jim Stanford ask his question now, if that's okay.
Steve, I'm sorry. I think that was my background sounding like Tony Abbott sucking, so I apologize. First of all, thank you both so much for those very rich, very bang-on presentations. I learn from both of you every time I hear you, so thank you for what you've done today and the last 50 years. My question was really about the political side, again, of political economy, as Frank was hinting. I think we have an opening, to tell you the truth, around the debate about what caused the current inflation. I think on the gut level, millions and millions of workers know it wasn't them. And they see their real wages falling, and they have seen their real wages stagnate for the decade before this. And I honestly think we've got an opening to push back at, not just the reactionary response to this inflation, but the whole NAIRU model that underpins that reactionary response. And so I wonder if you'd each have some thoughts about, we've seen in different places in the world, some analysts and even a couple of central banks acknowledging that profit margins were in fact the dominant cause of the post-COVID upsurge in inflation. Do you see potential in building on that and perhaps broadening understanding of post-Kaleckian things?
Oh,
While Steve's getting himself unmuted, I'll take over a quick answer. Here's Ross Gittins in the Sydney Morning Herald. Don't blame the workers for inflation. It's profits that's causing it. I don't think that reading Ross Gittins is going to turn people into being a raving socialist, but he is very sensible on this issue, and a lot of commentators are making this same point. The workers themselves, as you say, Jim, are increasingly aware that it's not their wage claims that have been driving inflation. At the best, they're able to catch up. We've just had a state election in New South Wales, and I think the fact that the incumbent Liberal government had put this wage cap on any increases for public servants was a pretty decisive element in that election, and the landslide swing towards a Labor win with a Labor government that says we're not going to. We're going to bargain with the interested parties, so with the unions, and try to get a fair deal. And I think a lot of people, apart from the fact that public service covers areas like teachers and nurses who have been the backbone of the nation during the difficult COVID years, that this was a real signal that we want to change. We want a deal that takes the spotlight off the Labor movement and puts it back where it should be, on the affordability of higher wages in a very difficult inflationary period.
I know that there won't be any change in mainstream economics as a result of finding out that it's markups that are driving up prices rather than wages. I've had direct personal experience with the economists at the Bank of England, some of whom are heterodox, most of whom are orthodox. And what they call their dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models depend upon the belief that interest rates control inflationary expectations. The failure for that to work at any point in history will not change them away from their models. They'll stick with it. So the only way you're going to get change is genuine political shift and changing the nature of economics as well. And I've also, after 50 years of trying to do that, I'm very pessimistic on that front as well. So I think we'll continue blundering forward with what happened in the 70s was the rising interest rates finally crushed credit-based demand. Credit-based demand collapsed, and then you fell into a huge slump. And the slump broke the back of corporations as well as workers. And you had a drop in both wage rises and the markup coming out of that. That's what I think is going to happen this time around as well, but straight through fragility of the banking sector this time around. That's the really major difference with the higher level of private debt. you've got more volatility on the income that they get out of bonds from the increase in interest rates driving down bond prices. And that's that side effect. You start destroying the banking sector. They're now creating a wet dream for the cryptocurrency enthusiasts, which is just ridiculous. But that's what they're doing by being in control of the central banks. But I think we're going to be stuck with permanent inflation because of the impact on the production system of hitting climate change and energy shortages. And in that sense, nothing is amenable to any policy when that's the problem you have. That's why the so-called labour productivity, is the output to labour ratio, that is likely to decline because energy is getting more expensive, less available, and we'll be forced to use less of it through climate change. And the cost of minerals is also rising. So all of that's going to give us cost pressures that no amount of government policy can alter.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. There was a question actually from Julia Thornton about how much can inflation also be connected to climate change. There's no historical data for the economic effects of climate change, so it's impossible to use the same research methods as is possible for an examination of the inflationary effects of war, but it causes the same kind of shortages. So was in the same line that you were saying. And now another question here that's repeating. So Jordan and Michael Haynes, they are asking about what would be the impact on inflation of a universal basic income, like implemented as a redistribution policy. Yeah. Steve, do you want to start this one?
Okay. A lot of modern monetary theorists, advocates are anti a universal basic income. I'm actually quite in favor of it overall because knowing what I know about climate change and how badly economists have underestimated the dangers, I think we're going to see a collapse in incomes coming out of that. And through no fault of anybody's, you'll be unemployed. You won't be able to necessarily find enough work. You don't want enough work to be done. You want to reduce energy consumption over time as well. So I think a universal basic income would provide capacity for people to stay alive, even if they're not working, whether that's because of a fall in the economy itself or government policy to reduce, to go into degrowth rather than growth, which I think is absolutely critical for the survival of human civilization. You've got to do it in such a way that poor don't starve to death. And if we do it at the moment with the current distribution of income, going to degrowth will mean the poor starve to death, and then you'll have social breakdown as a result of that. So I'm in favor of UBI, not so much because it's an inflation fighting tool, as I think it's one way of making sure the poor don't starve when we start going in reverse from economic growth to economic contraction.
Yes, I'd echo those comments. Somewhat whimsically, I recall that 105 years ago, Bertrand Russell wrote a book called Roads to Freedom, in which, among other things, he advocated guaranteed basic income. He argued that in an increasingly affluent society, this was an important means of ensuring that there would not be continuing pockets of poverty, and that the poor would not have to prove themselves to be in need. They would have income support as of right, and that for all sections of society, this would increase freedoms to use your time according to what is most socially useful. Bertrand Russell was particularly concerned about artists, creative people in the arts who could then devote themselves to that as their first priority. Perhaps earning a little supplementary income in other ways, but having the basic capacity to live and do socially useful activities as of right. And I think that time has come. We've waited 105 years since Russell was advocating it, and I think it is affordable. Wouldn't happen overnight. You do it incrementally. But certainly, if you've got some notion of fiscal responsibility, you wouldn't be going ahead with the stage 3 tax cuts, giving away money to the rich. Much better to introduce a system of a higher floor rather than a higher ceiling.
We have a question here in response to the answer Steve just gave, that he mentioned degrowth, and Bill Collius is asking, but wouldn't degrowth be inflationary?
I think it's got two choices: inflation or social catastrophe. We really have dramatically underestimated what climate change is doing to the biosphere. We're going to find out the hard way, quite possibly in the next decade. Approaches to do it, or we degrowth by chaos and catastrophe, end up in Mad Max. I'm trying as much as possible to get us to have a sustained civilization as we go through degrowth, rather than a breakdown of civilization as we go through degrowth. I don't think there are any other options.
I might interject to say that Steve has admirably set out that reasoning in his latest book called The New Economics. And there's a chapter there which really teases out those characteristics of the climate change challenge. And I completely endorse that. We've got difficult times ahead, but we're going to be in a much better position to deal with that new version of capitalism or barbarism, the traditional political choice, if we could, step by step, become a more cohesive and fair society. That's why I favor the universal basic income, why I favor fiscal policy with more progressive tax reform. Even mainstream economists like Ken Henry advocate, some steps in this direction, and it's to be hoped that the federal government under Labour leadership would initiate some kind of general review, certainly in a second term of office, if as I expect, they will be successful in extending their period in Canberra. These things have got to be done. And climate change can't be separated from any of these things. There needs to be social justice. There needs to be Indigenous people's recognition. After all, if we're talking about climate change, who's got the best sustainability credentials on the planet? The Indigenous people of Australia who lived sustainably for 60,000 years. So questions of social justice, sustainability, economic productivity, distribution of income and wealth are all interwoven. That's why some kind of Green New Deal embracing all those elements is what we need to move towards. Beyond that, if degrowth gets on the agenda, well, so be it. Like Steve, I suspect we're more likely to get degrowth through disaster rather than through a planned transition. I think we're more likely to get it through collapse of the existing economic order, certainly recession, the return of stagnation, stagflation. All of these things are right on the cards now. The financial institutions worldwide are looking increasingly shaky. The combination of the politics of austerity for the poor and bailouts for the rich is just not a sustainable model. We've got to move in a different direction, and if not now, when?
Yeah, just adding to that that comment, Frank, because when I made the first question talking about who is winning, right, with the inflation and with the remedy, the rising interest rates, you ended by saying that that would only change when society had enough and did something about it. And I often think that the universal basic income could be positive for that as well, because people having more time, they have more time to think critically, to talk to, community organization. At the moment, people leave to pay their bills, to do the, they're so busy that there is no time for that kind of organization. So it's very hard when you're exhausted to be an activist. So I have hope that the universal basic income could come and help in that area too.
Indeed.
We have a question here from Jeff. He's asking, what do you think of current criticisms of the RBA? How do you think it compares to other central banks? What changes are needed?
There are a bunch of brain-dead neoclassical economists, with the exception of I've forgotten the exact author, but there's Fisher and Kent, who wrote a brilliant paper explaining the 1890s depression was far worse for Australia than the 1930s, and bringing it back all to the levels of private debt and house prices. So the rest of them, I'd like to give them a universal basic income and get them out of the building. So I've spoken to the Bundesbank, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, not at the RBA, I might add, but I've interacted with RBA economists. I've got far more time for people in the Bundesbank and the Bank of England than I have for the RBA. They're quite second or third rate, even in the standard of central banks, where you tend to get the people who don't make it through and get their PhDs finished and become mainstream economics lecturers at universities. So, and very, very much dominated by a neoclassical mindset. So, no, I don't have any time for the RBA, I'm afraid.
Yes, I could just add a couple of comments about how the RBA manages interest rates. I earlier used that cliche about if the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, yeah, but it's a fallacy. The notion that you can use interest rate policy to deal with the cyclical character of a capitalist economy and somehow smooth out the ups and downs is cloud cuckoo land. I mean, it selectively used in conjunction with adjustment of fiscal policy in a coordinated way, like driving a car, not having, one foot on the brake and the other one on the gas and not working together. That's the least of the problems, though. The deeper problem is that, handing over the control of inflationary tendencies to an independent institution, albeit one, with lots of neoclassical economists, I don't think it would make all that much difference if they weren't neoclassical. And it's for that reason that I'm not overly confident that the current review that the federal government's carrying out of the Reserve Bank is going to lead to any dramatic change. I don't think it's going to widen the array of powers. It's probably not going to recommend the ending of the independence of the Reserve Bank from the government of the day. It may lead to some change in the personnel of the governors. I imagine Jim Chalmers and Albo would be sympathetic to that sort of step, having representatives of broader sections of the community, maybe a couple of post-Keynesian economists, Steve, wait by the phone. It might be ringing sometime later in the next few months. Mine won't, but yours could. It's a whole question of tinkering with the system, reform. I don't particularly even blame the current governor, although he seems to be coming up for a lot of fire. Indeed, he made a terrible error in predicting that low interest rate policy would be maintained for a couple of years just before, he started stepping on the interest rate brake, in order to slow the economy down. So he's not performed very admirably in the job, but changing the personnel isn't going to change the situation all that much. Hugh Stretton, the great Adelaide-based social scientist and historian, I think got it right when he said that the best approach to interest rate policy is to keep it fairly low and pretty stable. In other words, enable people who need to borrow money, whether for housing or starting a business, to be able to do so in a reasonably predictable environment about what will be their repayment stream over the years ahead. Fluctuating interest rates really add to the instability in the economy, and it's the instability that causes more financialization, because people get out of productive activities, which don't pay off very handsomely in many cases, and try to think that they're going to get rich through speculation. The shift from productive activity to speculative activity is the much more fundamental problem. I don't blame the Reserve Bank for that problem, but it's frankly not got any policy instruments at its disposal that would make a jot of difference to that underlying tendency to financialization and to concentration of corporate power and growing inequality. All you can say is that it could perhaps be a bit more selective in its policies, as taking into some account of how they impact on different sectors, different regions, and try to make some more marginal adjustments to deal with those inequalities and spatial differences. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it's a way of really confirming Steve's point that there's not much hope for a major change in the underlying economic problems arising from that quarter.
Tim Thornton has a question here. Tim, can you ask that yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you both for presenting. It's been really great. I'm just interested in your opinion in whether a degrowth economy that's not in crisis mode is necessarily post-capitalist in some sense?
Very much on my mind, Tim. You'll now see me arguing on my blog and in the lecture course I'm giving as well with that through that stevekeenfree.com link, that neoclassical economists won't give up on neoclassical economics even after they've destroyed capitalism. But what I think we'll find ourselves in a compulsory degrowth, if we're lucky enough to have governments existing in any functional sense at the time, rather than armed militias, which will be the case in America, quite likely. Then the government will be in control through fiscal policy, directing spending, rather than building Liberty ships. We'll be building as fast as we can alternative energy systems and trying to reverse some of the damage we've done to the climate, maybe through putting, this is a serious project, mirrors in the Arctic to reflect sunlight back out after we've destroyed the Arctic itself, this east ice that reflects most of the radiation that falls there. In that situation, the government will be telling those private corporations what to do in terms of manufacturing what's needed for the fighting climate change, in the same way that governments told corporations what to do when manufacturing what was needed to fight the Nazis. So you'll have corporations and firms, but you won't have capitalism. And in that sense, I think neoclassical economics will destroy what it doesn't understand, which is capitalism.
Thank you.
Yeah, Tim, if I could just pitch in a short answer to your good question. Yes, a post-growth economy must, I think, ultimately be a non-capitalist economy, because the essence of capitalism is the pursuit of profit, the drive for growth, and capital accumulation. If you take away, whether directly by government controls or by the effects of climate change and ecological calamity, the opportunities for profit and capital accumulation, capitalists will no longer play the game. Why would you, as a capitalist, pursue profits and capital accumulation if it's unlikely to materialize? So it's not that we've got to get rid of capitalism in order to embrace a degrowth economy. the two things go hand in hand. I mean, in a degrowth economy, you can still have markets. Mutually advantageous exchanges between people can occur in markets, but you wouldn't expect to have concentration of corporate power and the financial institutions that feed off their intermediary roles in the periods of economic instability. You'd have, in other words, presumably a lower average standard of living in material terms, but only on average. It would presumably be a more cooperative and more equitable social order. Now, the capitalists aren't going to say, oh, yeah, that sounds good. We'll agree to switch over to that. But over a period of 2, 3, 4 decades, assuming we're still living and breathing, you know, these transitions can occur.
Another thing I'd add there is
nothing inexorable or timeless about economic arrangements. They've evolved and changed over time, and we'll get more. Hard to see. My crystal ball clouds over at this particular point, but you know, it's on the cards.
Just one thing I wanted to add there. There's no way a pricing system will survive climate breakdown. If you have the current income distribution and you try to let climate change cause the price levels, then people have to buy stuff with their incomes, 40% of the population would starve to death. So the only way about that is rationing. And I've put a link there called a group called ecocore.org. And that's a group I'm supporting in London, who are trying to build a parallel currency system using carbon credits, tradable carbon credits. So the idea would be you have a rationing system for carbon, and you have to buy both the carbon price and the money price of anything in future. And the rationing would be far more determinative of who got to buy what at the low income levels than the wage income and so on, while the capitalists would need to be buying tradable carbon credits off the poor to be able to continue consuming. So you'd go to a rationing system, and fundamentally that's what we had during the Second World War. We need it far more seriously for climate change than we did for the Second World War.
I think we have time for one more question, and I would like to invite Janet McCalman to ask. She just wrote a question here about the excessive value of land. Janet, do you wanna ask? Maybe I'll just read the question. So Janet is asking, how do we tackle the excessive value of land, which is devouring both shelter and commerce?
I'd love to go first on this one, because I think...
Well, one thing I've been arguing for over a decade is a modern debt jubilee. The main thing which is causing rising land prices is rising private debt, leverage. You borrow more money to buy land, you're priving up the price of land. So I'd go for I want to reduce the level of private debt by a factor of 3, fundamentally, at least that level. Certainly household debt. And if you did that, you'd see land prices and house prices falling as well. Of course, that's a very unpopular opinion in Australia.
But how do you reduce debt?
Frank, you were going to, that was Jeanette saying...
I'm just going to chip in. We're obviously both keen to get in on this one.
Yes, please, your turn.
Land is so fundamental. Well, you know, I mean, frankly, mainstream economics is very deficient in its analysis of land, as well as all the other problems to which Steve has alluded. I mean, capital versus labor. I mean, even on the Marxian side of political debate, you know, the things tend to be couched in those terms. But as that lesser political economic figure, Henry George, reminded everyone 100 years ago, land is such a fundamental resource. It's fundamental to everything we do in terms of a productive economy, not just, of course, in the agricultural and mining sectors, but in everything in cities, everything, all aspects of modern society depend upon land. And when it becomes so expensive that the average family can't afford to buy a little plot to live in, then you're going to have compounding other social problems that follow from it. I mean, George argued that that was the fundamental problem why an increasingly affluent society could never overcome poverty. Because, you know, it's the private ownership of land, the capacity of landowners to reap the windfall gains from activities to which they make no productive contribution.
Yes.
That is the fundamental injustice. So land taxation is one avenue through which that may be redressed, but as I would argue, as part of a more general package of tax reform that creates more equitable distribution and, of course, provides more of the basic needs of society, whether through money in a universal basic income or through goods such as public housing and better public services, schools, hospitals, transport, etc., etc.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. I just want to read a couple of comments that I thought was interesting here. Stephen Reckick, he mentioned that any mention of wanting to curb profits and you get called a Marxist. So yes, yes, good one, Frank. And also one here from, okay, did I lose that one? No. Colin Sindel, and he's saying, could an alternative economic policy along the lines of what Frank and Steve are talking about be something Fabians could work towards to inform a next term of a Labour government? Well, that question is not to the, I don't think it's so much, I don't know if you want to comment anything on that, or if I should ask Sarah, our national chair, to comment on that. But
I'd love to add fuel to that
yes,
fire.
please.
I mean, this is the great Fabian tradition, isn't it? The coherent economic analysis based on evidence leading to practical policies and social progress. That is, as I understand it, the great Fabian tradition. So you bring together public intellectuals like Steve and myself, Tim Thornton in the audience, Jim Stanford, who asked that earlier question, people who are willing to use their partial expertise. For all of us floundering in relative states of ignorance, and but we do our best. But working together with political activists, with people who simply dream of a better society and some coherent steps towards progress, and with Labour governments in power, both federally, in states, Labour movement, you know, more generally, in which the Fabians have always played a key part as thinking contributions. This is a moment when things could be done to make progress after what's really been a terrible 10 years in Australia. We could really start to move. The answers aren't going to come overnight. The solutions aren't on the table. The problems that Steve alluded to are very fundamental, but bit by bit, I would hope that the Fabians can make a significant contribution to finding some solutions.
And I'll just chip in there because you asked me to, Fernando. I'm the national chair. We've set up a new research institute at the Fabians. We've always had several. We're the only democratic think tank in Australia. So not only do we get evidence-based research, these fantastic presentations from tonight, but we also marry that with a very democratic participatory style. And we have several current frontbenchers as members of the Fabians, and they're always contacting me to see what the latest ideas are. So I'll be sending on a video of this tonight, and any papers that you put in the chat, the report that Jim put in, and also Frank and Steve's, a transcript of this discussion, and be sending that on to the government. So yeah, thank you. Yep. Much
Well,
appreciated.
To close, I just want to say thank you to Steve and Frank. It was just amazing, an absolute delight to learn from you both. And I'm getting actually like several messages on the line of, we need more Fabian talks of this caliber. There's at least 5 messages in like that with lots of yes, please, replying to them. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And for you that is listening to this, if you're not a member yet, please consider joining the Fabians. Go to our website and join us. And I'll pass it on to Jeff now, our the chair of the Victorian branch, and he'll close this and do the segue for the online pub. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Fernanda, and thanks for our 2 totally brilliant speakers. Also, thank you for everybody that came along, because that's what makes these events so super interesting. The comments, the questions, as ever, were really fantastic. Thanks to Fernanda and the team for putting on this event. Another brilliant event, I think, for Fabians. If you want to watch it again, or if you arrived a bit late, you'll be able to see it very soon on our website and on our YouTube channel, where also you'll see lots of really interesting previous events that we've run. And if you do watch on YouTube, don't forget to like the videos and to subscribe to our channel. And that channel is really going to take off, I think. And it's the way that we get the message out to a much bigger audience. We will be having future events. At the moment, we are in the planning stages of an event on The Voice, and also an event on climate change. We also recently had an innovation which we call Fabians at the Pub, where you could just come down and sort of well done, Frank. You know, put the world to rights with like-minded people, which is what we all love doing. And we've got a good turn up to that. So we're going to make that a regular event. So you'll be seeing details about all these things coming up soon. Also want to mention that our AGM's coming up in May. And the key thing there is that, as people have said, there's so much we can do. There's so much work to do. This idea of the project on alternative economic policy is fabulous. All these things require work, organizing, and that sort of thing. And so we're always looking for people to join us in this, join our executive and so on. So think about that. And, you know, there's an opportunity at the AGM to come on. Well, there's an opportunity at any time, actually, but particularly in the AGM. It's now time to close this formal event and go down the online pub. For those that haven't ever been to our online pub before, the idea is that you can just step away from your screen, stretch your legs and all that sort of thing. Get yourself a drink if you haven't already got one. Frank's planner, he's a forward planner, so he's got one. And Steve as well. Oh no, that's just water. It could be whiskey. So get yourself a drink, some nibbles, and when you come back, you'll see an invitation to join a Zoom breakout room. You can stay along and chat about anything you want about tonight's event or anything else that's on your mind. Stay as short a time or long a time as you like. Thanks, everyone.